The silence inside the diadem of regret was not peaceful. It was the silence of a throat cut mid-scream, the airless void between one heartbeat and oblivion. Deck plating groaned under the weight of centuries, and somewhere in the bowels of the ship, a servitor wept oil through its vox grill. Captain Vespasian of the 3rd Legion stood alone in the observation gallery, watching the stars drift past like scattered bones. His armor, once a masterwork of violet and gold, was now tarnished gray, every piece of ornamentation filed away until only scars remained. He had done this himself, night after night, grinding his gauntlets against the ceramite until his hands bled inside the shells. Pain was supposed to mean something once. Now it was just another empty sensation, like all the others. Behind him, the door hissed open. He did not turn. The footsteps were light, deliberate, and he knew them as well as he knew the rhythm of his own degraded hearts. Apothecary Lurian crossed the Temen chamber with the careful grace of a man who had spent 10,000 years trying not to break things. His face was bare, pale as Terran marble, and his eyes held the sort of exhaustion that no amount of sleep could cure. He stopped beside Vespasian, close enough that their pauldrons almost touched, and together they stared out at the void. "The others are gathering," Lurian said quietly. His voice was hoarse, damaged by centuries of screaming prayers to gods that would not answer, and one god who answered too well. "They want to know if you've changed your mind." Vespasian said nothing for a long moment. In the reflection of the viewport, he could see his own face, gaunt and hollow, the cheekbones too sharp beneath skin that had forgotten how to properly heal. Once, he had been beautiful. They had all been beautiful. That was the joke, the cosmic jest that the universe had played upon them. Beauty had been their birthright and their curse, the thing that made them perfect and the thing that made them vulnerable. When Fulgrim fell, when the Phoenician opened his arms to she who thirsts, beauty became a weapon that cut inward. Perfection became a hunger that could never be satisfied, and in pursuing it, they had become the most imperfect things in all creation. "I haven't changed my mind," Vespasian said at last. His voice was rough, unused to certainty. "We proceed as planned." Lurian let out a breath that might have been relief or might have been despair. With them, the two were often indistinguishable. "Do you think it will work? Do you truly believe we can be forgiven?" Vespasian turned to face him then, and in his eyes was something that had not lived there for millennia. Not hope, exactly. Hope was too bright, too clean for things like them. But perhaps it was hope's shadow, the dim outline of what hope might look like if viewed from very far away. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I know that continuing as we are is damnation. At least this way, we first damn ourselves on our own terms." The assembly hall of the Diadem of Regret had once been a place of celebration, a grand chamber where the 3rd Legion would gather to toast their victories and admire the artistry of their conquests. Now it was a monument to decay. The frescoes on the walls had been defaced, not by enemy action but by the legionaries themselves, clawing away every image of their former glory until only bare stone remained. The banners that hung from the vaulted ceiling were grey and tattered, their heraldry scraped clean. Even the imperial aquila had been removed, not out of spite for the emperor but out of shame, because they no longer believed they had the right to stand beneath it. 372 Astartes stood in that hall. It was all that remained of a legion that had once numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Some wore their armor, some did not. Those who had shed their ceramite stood in simple robes of undyed cloth, their bodies marked with scars that they had inflicted upon themselves in penance. Others still bore the signs of their corruption, the mutations that Slaanesh had gifted them, and these warriors stood at the back of the hall with their heads bowed, as if proximity to their cleaner brothers might somehow contaminate them further. Vespasian ascended the platform at the chamber's heart, and the murmuring died. He looked out across the assembled faces, and he saw the same thing in all of them: exhaustion, regret, the faint, desperate ember of something that might have been redemption if they were very lucky and if the universe was more forgiving than they deserved. He knew many of these warriors by name. He had fought beside them on Terra during the siege, had reveled with them in the palace's desecration, had heard their laughter as they committed atrocities that should have been impossible for beings who had once been the emperor's finest. That was the thing about memory. It did not fade. It did not grant mercy. Every sin was as fresh as the moment it was committed, and they carried all of them. "Brothers," he began, and the word felt strange in his mouth. Once, it had been a greeting. Now it was a prayer. "We stand at the edge of a precipice. Behind us lies 10,000 years of degradation. Before us lies only uncertainty. But I tell you now, with what remains of my honor, that uncertainty is preferable to the certainty of what we have become." No one spoke, no one cheered. They had learned long ago that cheering led to excess, and excess led to the embrace of she who thirsts. So they listened in silence, and their silence was more powerful than any roar. "We cannot undo what we have done," Vespasian continued. His voice carried through the chamber, not amplified by voxcasters but by the simple acoustics of good architecture, the kind the Third Legion had once prized above all else. "We cannot unmake the atrocities. We cannot resurrect the dead or heal the wounds we have inflicted upon the Imperium. But we can choose to stop. We can choose to turn away from the Prince of Pleasure. We can choose to walk a different path, even if that path leads only to our own destruction." A voice called out from the back of the hall, raw and broken. "What makes you think the Emperor would even want us back?" Vespasian met the warrior's gaze across the distance. The speaker was Sergeant Aurelian, a line officer who had once been renowned for his skill with a blade. Now he was missing 3 fingers on his left hand, removed one by one over the course of a decade as punishment for the crime of enjoying battle too much. His face was a map of self-inflicted scars, and his eyes held the dull sheen of a man who had looked into the abyss and found himself reflected there. "He probably doesn't," Vespasian said simply. "We betrayed him. We sided with his greatest enemy. We desecrated his palace and butchered his servants. If he is still capable of emotion, then his only feeling toward us must be hatred. But this is not about what he wants. This is about what we need. We need to be something other than what we are. We need to prove, if only to ourselves, that we are still capable of choosing righteousness over pleasure, duty over desire." Another voice, this one from the front ranks. It belonged to Brother Sergeant Caspian, a warrior who had removed his own tongue 3 centuries ago to prevent himself from speaking the blasphemous hymns that she who thirsts whispered into his mind. He communicated now through sign language, his fingers moving in sharp, precise gestures that Vespasian had learned to read. The sign said, "And if we fail, then we fail." Vespasian answered, "But we will fail as warriors of the Third Legion, not as slaves of chaos. We will fail with our eyes open, our hearts pure, and our souls our own. That is worth dying for. That is worth suffering for." The silence that followed was long and heavy. Then, slowly, one by one, the warriors began to kneel. It started with the ones at the front, the officers and veterans who had served longest under Vespasian's command, and it spread backward through the ranks like a ripple through still water. Even the mutated ones knelt, their twisted bodies folding into postures of supplication, and when the last warrior had gone to his knee, Vespasian knelt as well. They knelt together in that ruined hall, 372 damned souls, and they offered a prayer to a God they were no longer certain would hear them. The prayer was simple. It had no artistry, no poetry, no beauty. It was the sort of prayer that a child might offer, clumsy and desperate and utterly sincere. "Emperor," they whispered as one, "we are sorry. We do not ask for forgiveness. We do not ask for mercy. We ask only for the chance to die in service to something greater than ourselves. Let us be your weapons one last time. Let us be the blade that cuts away the rot we have caused. Let us be worthy, if only for a moment, of the name we once bore." The stars gave no answer. The silence remained unbroken. But Vespasian rose to his feet, and the others rose with him, and in that moment, something changed. It was not redemption, it was not even hope, but it was a beginning, and for warriors who had spent 10 millennia drowning in their own corruption, a beginning was everything. The pilgrimage began at the edge of the maelstrom, in a system whose name had been scoured from all imperial records. The world they chose was called Lamontin, a place where the Third Legion had committed one of their most grievous sins. It had been a shrine world once, home to 3 billion pilgrims who had journeyed across the galaxy to walk the path of penitence, a 1,000-mile road that wound through mountains and valleys to the summit of Mount Calvaria, where a fragment of the Emperor's own armor was said to rest. When the Third Legion had come to Lamentine during the Heresy, they had defiled every shrine, slaughtered every pilgrim, and erected monuments to excess along the path of penitence. The road itself had been stained with blood and narcotics, and at the mountain's summit they had shattered the armor fragment and danced upon its pieces. Now, 10,000 years later, Vespasian and his brothers returned. The diadem of regret made orbit above Lamentine, and 372 Astartes descended to the surface in silence. They wore no helmets, choosing instead to feel the planet's air on their faces, the cold wind that cut like knives and carried the faint scent of ash. The planet was dead. The shrines were ruins. The pilgrims were dust. But the path of penitence remained, and the legionaries walked it. They walked barefoot, their boots left behind on the landing field. The stone tore at their feet, and the pain was a welcome thing, a reminder that they were still capable of feeling something other than the artificial sensations that Slaanesh inflicted. They walked in single file, each warrior separated from the next by 10 paces, and they spoke no words. There was nothing to say. The path would speak for them. The first monument they encountered was 3 miles from the landing site. It was a statue of Fulgrim, 20 feet tall, carved from black marble and inlaid with gold. The Phoenician was depicted in his moment of ascension, his forearms spread wide, his perfect face tilted back in ecstasy. At the statue's base were carved the names of every pilgrim who had died there, 3 million names in letters so small they could barely be read. Vespasian stopped before the monument and stared up at it for a long moment. Then he drew his blade, a simple gladius with no ornamentation, and he began to carve. He carved slowly, methodically, cutting away the gold inlay first, then chipping at the marble itself. The other warriors joined him, each one taking a section of the statue, and they worked in silence for 3 days until nothing remained but rubble. They did not speak of what they were doing. They did not need to. Every strike of blade against stone was a word, every chip of marble a prayer, and when the statue was finally reduced to dust, they moved on. The path of penitence was 1,000 miles long, and it took them 93 days to walk it. Along the way, they encountered 27 more monuments, each one a testament to their legion's depravity. There were altars where they had performed rituals too vile to name, arenas where they had forced captured soldiers to fight to the death for their amusement, galleries where they had displayed the flayed skins of saints. Each monument was destroyed, and with each destruction, the legionaries felt something shift inside them. It was not absolution, it was not even relief, but it was progress, and progress was a mercy they had not expected. At night, they made camp along the path, and in the firelight, they spoke, not of their sins, not directly, but of the things they remembered from before the fall. Brother Thaddeus, who had been a sculptor before he was elevated to the ranks of the Astartes, spoke of a statue he had made as a child, a simple thing carved from wood and depicting his mother's hands folded in prayer. He had given it to her on the day he left for the trials, and she had wept. He did not know what had become of her, whether she had died of age or violence, but he remembered her hands and the way they had trembled when she held his gift. Apothecary Lurian spoke of music. Before the heresy, he had played the violin, an ancient instrument from Terra's pre-Unity days, and he had been skilled enough that even Fulgrim himself had praised his technique. But after the fall, music had become a weapon, a tool to inflict sensation and madness, and he had not touched his instrument in 9,000 years. He did not know if he could still play, but he remembered the feeling of the bow moving across the strings, the way the notes would rise and fall like a conversation between souls. Captain Vespasian spoke of duty. He spoke of the first time he had stood on the walls of the imperial palace during the Great Crusade, when the emperor himself had walked among the legions and inspected his warriors. Vespasian had been a newly promoted captain then, young and proud and certain that he was part of something eternal. The emperor had stopped before him, and for just a moment their eyes had met. Vespasian had expected grandeur, majesty, perhaps even wrath. Instead, he had seen sorrow, a deep and ancient sadness that seemed to encompass all of humanity's suffering. The emperor had nodded once, a simple acknowledgement, and then he had moved on. Vespasian had carried that moment with him through all the centuries since, even during the darkest days of his corruption, and now he wondered if perhaps that sorrow had been a warning, a glimpse of the future that awaited those who strayed from the path. On the 93rd day, they reached the summit of Mount Calvaria. The shrine at the peak was a ruin, its walls collapsed, its altar desecrated. The fragment of the emperor's armor was long gone, either taken by scavengers or destroyed by the legionaries themselves during their rampage. But the view from the summit was breathtaking. From that height, they could see the entire planet spread out below them, a patchwork of ruins and wasteland. And beyond that, the stars themselves, cold and distant and indifferent. Vespasian stood at the edge of the precipice and looked out across the world they had broken. Behind him, his brothers gathered, and together they stood in silence. Then, as one, they dropped to their knees and pressed their foreheads to the stone. The stone was cold, rough, and it scraped their skin. Some of them bled. All of them wept, though their tears were silent and their faces remained still. They wept for Lamentin. They wept for the pilgrims. They wept for themselves and for the things they had become. And when the weeping was done, they rose, and they descended the mountain, and they returned to their ship. Lamentine was the first world. There were others. The next system they traveled to was called Harmonia's Rest, and it had been a Skolem world, a place where the children of imperial officials were educated in the arts of administration and governance. The Third Legion had come to Harmonia's Rest in the closing years of the heresy, and they had turned the Skolems into laboratories of sensation. The children had been the experiments. Vespasian did not allow himself to remember the details, but he knew that of all the sins his legion had committed, this one was the most unforgivable. Children were supposed to be innocent. Children were supposed to be spared. When they arrived at Harmonia's Rest, they found that the planet had been quarantined by the Inquisition. An orbital blockade of 3 ships hung in high anchor, and as soon as the diadem of regret entered the system, they were hailed by the blockade's commander, an inquisitor named Sabathiel. Her voice crackled over the vox, cold and sharp as a knife. "Unidentified vessel, you are in violation of inquisitorial edict. State your business or be destroyed." Vespasian stood in the ship's command throne and considered his options. He could lie, claim that they were a rogue trader or a merchant convoy, but lies had become repugnant to him. He could fight, but that would defeat the purpose of their pilgrimage. Or he could tell the truth and accept whatever judgment came. He opened a vox channel and spoke clearly. "Inquisitor Sabathiel, this is Captain Vespasian of the Emperor's Children. We have come to atone for the crimes we committed on this world. We seek no conflict. We ask only for the chance to set right what we destroyed." The silence that followed was long and tense. Then Sabathiel's voice returned, and it was filled with a cold fury that Vespasian understood perfectly. "You dare to speak of atonement, traitor? You, who defiled this world and slaughtered its children? You think you can simply walk back into imperial space and ask for forgiveness?" "No," Vespasian said quietly. "We do not ask for forgiveness. We know that is beyond us. But we ask for the chance to serve. Let us rebuild what we destroyed. Let us labor in penance. And when our work is done, you may execute us if you wish. We will not resist." Another silence. Then, unexpectedly, a different voice came over the vox. It was older, weathered, and it carried the weight of authority. "This is Canoness Celestine of the Order of the Argent Shroud. I am aboard the Inquisitor's flagship as an advisor. Captain Vespasian, I have heard your words, and I find them unexpected. But words are wind. If you truly seek redemption, then prove it. You will be allowed to descend to the surface under our supervision. Any sign of corruption, any hint of treachery, and we will annihilate you from orbit. Do you understand? We understand, Vespasian said, and we thank you for this chance. The canoness did not respond, and the Vox went silent. 30 minutes later, they received landing coordinates. Harmonia's rest was worse than Lamentine. At least Lamentine had been empty, its horrors long since turned to dust. But Harmonia's rest was still inhabited, and the people who lived there were the descendants of the survivors. They were a broken people, haunted and scarred, and they had built their new settlements far from the ruins of the old scolums, as if proximity to those places might reawaken the nightmares. When Vespasian and his brothers descended to the surface, they were met by a detachment of battle sisters, 20 warriors in black and silver power armor, their bolters trained and ready. The canoness stood at their head, her face hidden behind her helmet, and she watched the traitor marines disembark with the stillness of a statue. You will work under our station supervision, she said, her voice cold and clipped. You will rebuild the scolums, you will repair what you broke, and you will do so without speaking to any of the civilians. They do not need to know who you are or what you were. Do you accept these terms? We accept, Vespasian said. The work began immediately. The scolums had been burned and shattered, their walls collapsed, their libraries turned to ash. The legionaries cleared the rubble with their bare hands, lifting stones that would have required machinery for baseline humans. They worked in silence, their movements efficient and precise, and they did not stop even when their muscles screamed and their augmented bodies began to falter. The battle sisters watched them constantly, never lowering their weapons, and the canoness herself stood vigil from a nearby hill, her gaze never leaving them. Days became weeks, weeks became months. Slowly, the scolums began to rise again. The legionaries were skilled in construction, as all Astartes were, and they applied that skill with a fervor that bordered on obsession. They carved new stones to replace the ones that had been destroyed. They rebuilt the walls with perfect precision, ensuring that every angle was true and every joint was seamless. They even carved new frescoes on the interior walls, simple images of children studying and playing, because the old frescoes had been too defiled to be described. And all the while, they did not speak, did not complain, did not rest beyond what was necessary to keep their bodies functional. On the 67th day of their labor, a child approached the construction site. She was perhaps 8 years old, thin and pale, with dark eyes that held the sort of wariness that no child should ever need to possess. She stopped at the edge of the cleared ground and stared up at the legionaries, and one of them, Brother Caspian, noticed her. He stopped his work and turned to face her, and for a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Then the child spoke. "Why are you here?" Caspian could not answer, not with words, but he knelt slowly and picked up a stone. He placed it carefully atop the wall he was building, and then he looked back at the child and tapped his chest, once, over his primary heart. The gesture was simple, but the child seemed to understand. She nodded, and then she turned and ran back toward the settlement. Caspian watched her go, and when he returned to his work, there were tears running down his scarred face. The canoness saw this exchange, and that night, she spoke with Vespasian. They met in the ruins of what had once been the Scolum's Chapel, a place where the Third Legion had performed rituals that turned prayer into blasphemy. Now it was just an empty shell, its walls bare, its altar missing. "Tell me," the canoness said, her voice softer than it had been before, though no less wary. "Why now? Why, after 10,000 years, do you choose this path?" Vespasian stood with his back to her, staring up at the sky through a gap in the ceiling. The stars were bright tonight, hard and cold as diamonds. "Because we were running out of time," he said quietly. We could feel her pull growing stronger. Every day, it became harder to resist. Every night, the whispers grew louder. We realized that if we did not change, we would be lost forever. and some of us, at least, were not ready to be lost. But you are already lost, the canoness said. You have committed atrocities that can never be forgiven. You have slain innocents. You have betrayed the emperor. What makes you think you can come back from that? We can't, Vespasian said simply. He turned to face her, and in his eyes was a clarity that surprised her. We will never be forgiven. We will never be redeemed. But we can choose to stop adding to the list of our sins. We can choose to spend whatever time we have left trying to repair what we broke. It won't be enough. It will never be enough. But it is all we have. The canoness was silent for a long moment. Then she removed her helmet, and Vespasian saw her face for the first time. She was older than he had expected, her skin lined with scars, her eyes hard but not unkind. My order fought your legion on terror, she said quietly. We lost many sisters that day. I lost friends. I lost a woman I loved. So understand that when I say this, I am not offering you forgiveness or absolution. But I will acknowledge that what you are doing takes more courage than what you were doing before. For what little it is worth, I believe you are sincere. It is worth a great deal, Vespasian said. Thank you. They completed the reconstruction of Harmonia's Rest in 5 months. When the last stone was laid and the last fresco was carved, the legionaries gathered in the central courtyard of the largest scolum and knelt once more. The canoness stood before them, her sisters at her back, and she looked out across the assembled traitor marines with an inside expression that might have been respect or might have been pity. You have done good work here, she said. The scolums stand again. The children will be able to learn in safety. But this does not erase what you did. It does not bring back the dead. It is simply a small gesture toward a debt that can never be repaid. We know, Vespasian said, and we are grateful that you allowed us to make it. The canoness nodded. Then she did something unexpected. She drew her bolt pistol, but instead of aiming it at the legionaries, she aimed it at the sky. She fired once, a single shot that echoed across the courtyard and faded into silence. That is for the ones you killed, she said. And this is for the ones you saved today. She lowered the weapon and holstered it. Go, continue your pilgrimage, and know that if we meet again, I will not hesitate to execute you if you stray from this path. Understood, Vespasian said. They left Harmonia's Rest that night, and as the diadem of regret climbed into orbit, Vespasian stood in the observation gallery and watched the planet shrink below them. He could see the lights of the settlements, warm and golden against the darkness, and he thought about the child who had asked him why he was there. He hoped she would have a good life. He hoped she would never know who had built the walls that kept her safe. The pilgrimage continued. They traveled to Vorgon's Reach, where they had slaughtered an entire regiment of the Astra Militarum and left their bodies arranged in obscene patterns across the battlefield. They traveled to Epsilon Tertius, where they had corrupted a cardinal and turned his cathedral into a temple of excess. They traveled to Maledict's End, where they had unleashed a psychic weapon that drove an entire hive city mad with pleasure and pain until the citizens tore themselves apart in search of greater sensation. At each world, they labored, they built, they repaired, and at each world, they were met with suspicion and hatred, which they accepted as their due. But slowly, over years, something began to change. Word of their pilgrimage spread, carried by the Inquisition and the ecclesiarchy, and it became a subject of debate among the Imperium's highest officials. Some called it a trick, a ploy by chaos to infiltrate imperial worlds. Others called it genuine, a sign that even the fallen could seek redemption. And still others called it irrelevant, because regardless of their intentions, the emperor's children were traitors, and traitors deserved only death. Vespasian did not concern himself with the debate. He and his brothers simply continued their work, moving from world to world, and with each act of penance, they felt the pull of Slaanesh weaken just a little. It was not gone, not by any measure. The whispers still came at night, promising pleasure and perfection, and some of the legionaries faltered. 12 brothers fell back into corruption over the years and had to be executed by their own comrades. Their bodies burned, and their ashes scattered to prevent any possibility of resurrection. Each loss was mourned, but each loss also strengthened the resolve of those who remained. On the 73rd world they visited, a place called Saints' Reach, they encountered something unexpected. The world was a fortress monastery, home to a chapter of Space Marines called the Crimson Wardens, and when Vespasian requested permission to land and perform their penance, the chapter master himself came to meet them. His name was Lord Commander Dracos, and he was a giant even among Astartes, clad in Terminator armor that bore the scars of 1,000 battles. He stood in the hangar bay of his fortress, with 50 of his warriors at his back, and when Vespasian descended the boarding ramp of his transport, Dracos leveled a storm bolter at his chest. "Give me one reason," Dracos said, his voice like grinding stone. "Why I should not execute you where you stand." Vespasian stopped 5 paces away, and met the chapter master's gaze without flinching. "Because we are trying to be better than we were," he said simply. "Because we are trying to atone for crimes that can never be forgiven. And because if you kill us now, you will be ending the only thing that gives us purpose." "You betrayed the Emperor," Dracos said, his finger tightening on the trigger. "You sided with Fulgrim and brought ruin to Terra. You have no right to speak of purpose or atonement. You are traitors, and traitors deserve only death." "Yes," Vespasian agreed. "We do. But death is easy. Death is an escape. What we are doing is harder than dying. Every day, we wake up and face what we have become. Every day, we work to repair the damage we caused. Every day, we resist the call of she who thirsts. And every day, it gets a little easier. If you kill us now, you rob us of the one thing that might actually hurt chaos, which is the knowledge that even the fallen can choose to turn away." Dracos stared at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, he lowered his weapon. "You will work under my supervision," he said, "and at the end of your labor, we will duel, you and I. If you survive, you may leave. If you do not, your brothers may continue their pilgrimage. Do you accept these terms?" "I accept," Vespasian said. The work on Saints' Reach was different from the other worlds. Here, there were no ruins to rebuild, no monuments to destroy. Instead, the Crimson Wardens set the Emperor's children to a task that was both humbling and instructive. They were to serve as laborers in the chapter's manufactorum, working alongside serfs and servitors to produce bolter rounds, repair armor, and maintain the fortress's infrastructure. It was menial work, the sort of labor that baseline humans usually performed, and it required the legionaries to set aside their pride and simply obey. They did so without complaint. Captain Vespasian worked the forges, his hands blistering inside his gauntlets as he hammered ceramite plates into shape. Apothecary Lurian sorted medical supplies in the apothecarian, cataloging vials of stimulants and antibiotics with the same care he had once used to dissect his victims. Brother Caspian, the tongueless sergeant, cleaned the chapter's reliquaries, polishing ancient armor and weapons until they gleamed. And all of them, from the highest officer to the lowest line trooper, accepted the work with humility, because it was work that needed doing, and doing it reminded them that even the smallest task had value if performed with the right intent. On the 90th day, the work was complete. Vespasian reported to Lord Commander Dracos in the chapter master's sanctum, a vast chamber lined with banners and trophies from 1,000 campaigns. Dracos stood waiting in the center of the room, his Terminator armor removed, clad instead in simple training robes. In his hand was a power sword, and at his feet was a second blade, unlit and waiting. "Pick it up," Dracos said. Vespasian did as instructed, lifting the blade and feeling its weight. It was well balanced, a master-crafted weapon, and it felt familiar in his hand, despite the centuries since he had last wielded one in honest combat. He activated the power field, and the blade ignited with a hum, wreathing itself in a corona of blue energy. "Fight me," Dracos said. "Show me that you remember what it means to be a warrior of the Emperor." They circled each other in silence, two giants moving with the grace of predators. Then Dracos struck, his blade descending in a brutal overhead chop that would have split Vespasian from crown to pelvis if it had landed. But Vespasian sidestepped, his movements fluid and precise, and he countered with a thrust aimed at Dracos's exposed flank. The chapter master twisted, deflecting the blow with his own blade, and the two weapons met with a shower of sparks. They fought for an hour, trading blows that would have killed lesser warriors, and with each exchange, something changed in Vespasian. The muscle memory returned, the old training reasserting itself, and he remembered what it felt like to fight not for pleasure or excess, but for duty and honor. His strikes became sharper, his defenses tighter, and he began to press the attack with a ferocity that surprised even himself. Dracos responded in kind, his own blade moving faster, his technique adapting to counter Vespasian's assault. And then, in a move so sudden that Vespasian almost missed it, the chapter master dropped low and swept his leg out, catching Vespasian behind the knee. The traitor captain fell, his blade skittering across the floor, and a moment later, Dracos's sword was at his throat. "You fight well," Dracos said, breathing hard. "Better than I expected, but you are still a traitor, and that will always define you." Vespasian looked up at him and nodded. "I know, and I accept that. But I will die trying to be something better, even if I never succeed." Dracos held the blade at his throat for a long moment. Then he withdrew it and offered his hand. Vespasian took it, and the chapter master pulled him to his feet. "Go," Dracos said. "Continue your pilgrimage, and know that if you ever stray from this path, I will hunt you myself and end you." "I would expect nothing less," Vespasian said. They departed Saints' Reach the following dawn, and as the diadem of regret cleared the system's edge, Vespasian found himself thinking about the duel. Not the outcome, which had been inevitable, but the feeling that had come over him during the fight. For just a moment, blade in hand and purpose in his heart, he had felt like a loyalist again, like a true son of the emperor. The feeling had not lasted, of course, it never did, but it had been there, bright and clean as a star, and it gave him something he had not possessed in 10,000 years, the certainty that who they had been was not completely destroyed. Buried, corrupted, twisted, beyond recognition, but not completely gone. The years continued to pass. 116 worlds, 116 acts of penance, and with each world, the legion grew smaller. Some fell to the whispers of Slaanesh, dragged back into damnation despite their best efforts. Others died in accidents during the reconstruction work, their bodies crushed under falling stone or burned in manufactorum fires, and these deaths were accepted as a form of mercy. A few simply vanished, walking away from the pilgrimage in the night, unable to continue bearing the weight of their guilt. Vespasian did not pursue them. He understood that not everyone could endure this path, and he held no judgment for those who could not. By the time they reached the 150th world, only 83 legionaries remained. They were all veterans now, warriors who had survived not just the pilgrimage, but the constant war against their own natures. Their armor was battered and gray, their faces lined with new scars, and their eyes held a weariness that went deeper than flesh. But they continued, because stopping would mean surrender, and surrender would mean damnation. The 150th world was called Memoria. It had been a cemetery world, a place where the honored dead of the Imperium were interred in vast underground crypts. During the heresy, the Third Legion had come to Memoria and desecrated the tombs, raising the dead as puppets for their amusement and using the sacred grounds as an arena for their games. The planet had been declared perdita afterward, abandoned by the ecclesiarchy and left to rot, because no one wanted to set foot on ground so thoroughly defiled. When Vespasian and his brothers arrived, they found Memoria in ruins. The crypts had collapsed, exposing bones to the open air. The monuments had been toppled, the gardens of remembrance had withered to dust. It was a planet of silence and sorrow, and walking its surface felt like treading on a mass grave. The legionaries worked here for 2 full years, longer than any previous world, because the task of repairing Memoria was immense. They rebuilt the crypts stone by stone. They carved new monuments to replace the ones they had destroyed. They even gathered the scattered bones and returned them to their proper resting places, handling each skeleton with a reverence that felt almost alien after so many centuries of desecration. On the final day of their labor, as the sun set over the restored gardens, Apothecary Lurien approached Vespasian. The two of them stood together on a hill overlooking the planet's largest cemetery, and for a long time, neither spoke. Then Lurien said, very quietly, "Do you think they can hear us? The dead, I mean. Do you think they know what we've done here?" Vespasian considered the question. Once, he would have dismissed it as sentimentality, the sort of weakness that Fulgrim had taught them to despise. But now, after 150 worlds and 2 centuries of penance, he found himself hoping that the answer was yes. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I think it matters that we tried. Even if they can't hear us, even if the Emperor himself looks away, we did this because it was right. That has to count for something." Lurien nodded slowly. Then he reached into his armor and withdrew something that Vespasian had not seen in millennia. A violin, its wood dark and polished, its strings gleaming in the fading light. "I've been carrying this for 9,000 years, Lurien said. "I took it from my quarters on the Proudheart before the ship was destroyed. I told myself I would never play it again, that I had lost the right. But I think, maybe, I was wrong. Music was never the sin. What we did with it was..." He raised the instrument to his shoulder and drew the bow across the strings. The first note was hesitant, uncertain, as if the violin itself had forgotten how to sing. But then the second note came, and the third, and, slowly, a melody emerged. It was not a grand composition, not one of the virtuoso pieces that Lurien had performed before the fall. It was something simpler, a lullaby perhaps, or a mourning song. The kind of music that a mother might hum to a child, or that friends might play at a funeral. It was humble and honest, and achingly beautiful. And as it drifted across the cemetery, Vespasian felt something break inside him. He wept. Not the silent tears of the mountain summit, but true, racking sobs that shook his entire body. And Lurien played on, the melody rising and falling like breath, like a heartbeat, like forgiveness that would never come but was offered anyway. When the song finally ended, the sun had set completely, and the stars had emerged overhead. Vespasian wiped his face with the back of his gauntlet and looked at his friend. "Thank you," he said. Lurien smiled, and it was the first genuine smile Vespasian had seen on his face in 10,000 years. "We're going to make it," the apothecary said. "I don't know how, and I don't know where we'll end up, but I think we're going to make it." Vespasian wanted to believe him. He truly did. But he had lived too long and seen too much to accept comfort easily. Still, he nodded, because hope, even fragile hope, was worth nurturing. "Perhaps," he said. "Perhaps we will." They departed Memoria the following morning, and as they climbed back into orbit, Vespasian made a decision. They had traveled to 150 worlds, and they had performed penance on each one. But there was one world left, one final destination that they had been avoiding because it was the most painful of all. It was time to go home. It was time to return to Terra. The journey to the Sol system took 3 months, and every day of that journey was filled with dread. The closer they came to humanity's cradle, the more the whispers of Slaanesh intensified, because she who thirsts knew what they intended, and she was furious. The diadem of regret shuddered and groaned as it traveled through the warp, its Geller fields straining against psychic pressure that felt like claws scraping against the hull. Crewmen went mad and had to be restrained. Servitors malfunctioned and began speaking in tongues. And the legionaries themselves felt the pull stronger than ever before, the temptation to simply let go and embrace the pleasure and perfection that had once defined them. But they held. They held because they had come too far to fail now. They held because every world they had rebuilt was a chain binding them to their new purpose. They held because Vespasian stood on the bridge every hour of every day, his presence a reminder that their captain had not faltered, and so neither would they. And when the diadem of regret finally broke through the veil and emerged in real space at the edge of the Sol system, They found themselves staring at Terra itself, that ancient blue jewel hanging in the void like a promise or a threat. The system's defenses responded immediately. Dozens of ships moved to intercept them, cruisers and battleships of the Imperial Navy, their weapons charging and their vox channels demanding identification. Vespasian opened communications and spoke the words he had been practicing for months. "This is Captain Vespasian of the 3rd Legion. We are traitors. We are heretics. We have come to stand before the Golden Throne and accept judgment for our crimes. We will not resist. We will not flee. We ask only for the chance to kneel before the Emperor one final time." The response came not from the Navy, but from the Adeptus Custodes. The voice that crackled over the vox was cold and ancient, devoid of mercy or compassion. "You are not welcome in this system, traitor. Turn back now or be destroyed." "We will not turn back," Vespasian said. "If you wish to destroy us, then do so. But know that we have spent 200 years walking a path of penance. We have rebuilt 50 worlds. We have resisted the call of chaos with every breath we have taken. And if we are to die, we will die as warriors who tried to be worthy of the Emperor's vision, not as slaves of the dark gods." Silence. Long, tense silence that stretched until Vespasian thought his heart would stop from the pressure. Then a new voice entered the channel, and this one was different. It was warm, human, and it carried the weight of absolute authority. "This is Tribune Valoris of the Adeptus Custodes. Captain Vespasian, your words have been heard. Your actions have been noted. You will be permitted to approach Terra, but you will do so under escort and with your weapons disabled. Any deviation from this order will result in immediate annihilation. Do you accept these terms?" "We accept," Vespasian said, and he allowed himself to breathe. The journey from the system's edge to Terra took 6 days, and every moment of it was watched by the custodians. Golden warships flanked the diadem of regret on all sides, their weapons locked on target, ready to fire at the slightest provocation. But Vespasian and his brothers made no aggressive moves. They simply sat in silence, waiting, and when Terra finally filled the viewport, vast and ancient and impossibly beautiful, many of them wept. They had not seen Terra since the siege. They had not stood upon its surface since the day they betrayed everything it represented, and now, returning after 10,000 years, they felt the weight of their sins more acutely than ever before. This was the world they had desecrated. This was the palace they had tried to destroy. This was the throne upon which the Emperor still sat, dying forever, watching over humanity with eyes that saw everything. The diadem of regret was guided into a landing zone on the outskirts of the Imperial Palace, in a section of wasteland that had never been rebuilt after the heresy. Vespasian and his 82 remaining brothers descended the boarding ramp and found themselves facing a phalanx of custodians, 300 of the Emperor's finest, their guardian spears gleaming in the harsh sunlight. At their head stood Tribune Valoris himself, a giant clad in auramite armor that seemed to drink in the light and reflect it back as pure gold. "Captain Vespasian," the Tribune said, his voice resonating through his armor's vox grill, "you and your brothers will surrender your weapons, you will remove your armor, and you will follow us into the palace. Any resistance will be met with immediate execution." The legionaries complied without hesitation. They laid down their blades and bolters. They unsealed their armor and stepped out of the ceramite shells that had protected them for centuries, standing exposed in simple bodysuits that left them vulnerable. And then, barefoot and unarmed, they followed the custodians into the Imperial Palace. The walk through the palace was the longest of Vespasian's life. They passed through corridors that he remembered from the siege, walls that still bore the scars of bolter fire and melter burns. They walked across courtyards, where his legion had fought and killed and reveled in the carnage. And everywhere they looked, there were reminders of what they had done, statues commemorating the fallen defenders, plaques listing the names of those who had died holding the walls, memorial gardens where the ashes of heroes were interred. The weight of it all pressed down on Vespasian until he could barely breathe, and he knew his brothers felt the same. They descended into the depths of the palace, down stairways that seemed to go on forever, through checkpoints guarded by more custodians, deeper and deeper, until the air itself felt heavy with age and grief. And then, finally, they emerged into a vast chamber, and at its center was the golden throne. Vespasian had expected grandeur, he had expected majesty, but what he saw was something else entirely. The throne was vast, yes, a mountain of machinery and psychic apparatus that stretched up into darkness. But it was also a prison, a life support system for a being who should have died 10,000 years ago but who was forced to endure for the sake of humanity. And at the heart of it all, barely visible through the crackling energy fields and the haze of psychic power, was the Emperor himself. He was not the figure Vespasian remembered. The Emperor he had known during the Great Crusade had been vital, powerful, a being of such presence that reality itself seemed to bend around him. But the figure on the throne was a withered husk, his flesh desiccated, his body broken. Only his eyes remained alive, burning with a light that was not entirely physical, and those eyes were fixed on the legionaries with an intensity that made Vespasian want to look away. Tribune Valorous gestured, and the legionaries knelt. All 83 of them dropped to their knees on the cold stone floor and pressed their foreheads to the ground. Vespasian could feel the Emperor's gaze upon him, could feel it peeling back layers of pretense and deception until nothing remained but the truth of who and what he was. And in that moment, with no armor and no weapons and no pride to shield him, he spoke. "Father," he said, and his voice was barely a whisper. "We have sinned. We betrayed you. We sided with your enemies. We caused suffering beyond measure. We do not ask for forgiveness. We do not ask for mercy. We ask only that, we tried to be better. We tried to atone. And if our atonement is insufficient, if our efforts mean nothing, then we accept whatever judgment you deem appropriate." The silence that followed was absolute. Not even the machinery of the throne made sound. The entire chamber seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the Emperor's response. And then, impossibly, Vespasian heard a voice. It was not spoken aloud, not something that could be heard with ears. It resonated directly in his mind, in his soul, and it carried with it the weight of infinite sorrow and infinite love. "My sons," the voice said, and it was the Emperor's voice, undeniable and absolute, "you were lost. You strayed from the path I set for you. You embraced corruption and brought ruin to my imperium. But you have also chosen to return. You have spent 2 centuries walking a road that offered no reward but suffering. You have rebuilt what you destroyed. You have resisted the dark gods. And in doing so, you have proven that even the fallen can choose redemption. I cannot forgive you. Forgiveness is not mine to grant, for the crimes you committed were not only against me but against all of humanity. But I can acknowledge what you have done, and I can tell you that your efforts were not in vain." Vespasian's vision blurred with tears. Around him, his brothers were weeping openly, their bodies shaking with the force of their emotion. The Emperor continued, his voice gentle and terrible at once. "You will not be welcomed back into the Imperium. You will not be given honor or glory, but you will be given purpose. There are places in the galaxy where my light does not reach, where chaos festers and corruption spreads. You will go to those places. You will fight in my name. You will spend the rest of your days waging a war that no one will see and no one will celebrate. And when you finally fall, as all warriors must, you will die knowing that you did what you could to make amends. This is not redemption, my sons, but it is enough." The voice faded, and the weight of the Emperor's presence lifted. Vespasian remained kneeling, his forehead pressed to the stone, and he felt something settle inside him. Not peace, exactly, not absolution, but acceptance. They had been given a purpose, they had been given a way forward, and that was more than they had any right to expect. Tribune Valorous stepped forward and spoke, his voice breaking the silence. "You will depart Terra within the hour. You will be given coordinates to your first mission, and you will never return to this system. Do you understand?" "We understand," Vespasian said, "and we are grateful." They rose to their feet and turned to leave, but as they did, Vespasian looked back one final time at the golden throne. The Emperor's eyes were still upon him, burning with that terrible light, and in them Vespasian saw something he had not expected. Not forgiveness, not acceptance, but recognition. The Emperor saw them, truly saw them, and he knew what they had done. That was enough. The diadem of regret departed Terra that evening, and as it climbed into orbit and set course for the coordinates the custodians had provided, Vespasian stood in the observation gallery and looked back at the receding planet. Apothecary Lurian joined him, and together they watched Terra shrink until it was just another star in the void. "Do you think we'll ever see it again?" Lurian asked. "No," Vespasian said, "but that's all right. We saw it last time. That's more than I thought we'd ever get." They traveled to the coordinates and found themselves at the edge of the Eye of Terror, in a region of space where reality frayed and chaos bled through into the materium. Their mission, as delivered by the custodians, was simple: fight the forces of chaos wherever they appeared. Disrupt their plans, destroy their strongholds, die if necessary, but take as many of the enemy with them as possible. It was a suicide mission, the kind of deployment that no sane commander would assign to troops they valued. But for the Emperor's children, it was a gift. They fought for decades. They raided chaos outposts on demon worlds. They ambushed convoys carrying slaves and weapons to traitor legions. They sabotaged rituals and assassinated sorcerers. And with every battle, they felt themselves changing, not corrupting, not falling back into old patterns, but hardening, becoming something new. They were no longer the Emperor's children, not truly. They were something else, something that existed between loyalty and damnation. Warriors who had chosen to fight for the Imperium despite knowing they would never be accepted by it. Their numbers continued to dwindle. Brother Caspian fell on a world called Vrakis, his body torn apart by a daemon prince while he held the line so his brothers could escape. Sergeant Aurelian died on the hull of a Chaos cruiser, his suit breached by a cultist's blade, but he took 17 enemies with him before the void claimed him. One by one, the last of the Third Legion's penitent souls were extinguished, until only a handful remained. On the 200th year of their pilgrimage, Vespasian and Apothecary Lurian found themselves on a barren moon, orbiting a dead star. They were the last two. All the others were gone, their names carved into a memorial stone that Vespasian carried in his armor. They had been sent to this moon to investigate reports of a chaos ritual, and they had found it, a circle of sorcerers attempting to summon something from the warp, something vast and terrible that would consume entire systems if unleashed. They attacked without hesitation. 2 warriors against 50 sorcerers and 100 cultists. It should have been hopeless, but Vespasian and Lurian fought with the fury of men who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. They carved through the cultists like reapers through wheat. They shattered the sorcerers' wards and disrupted their ritual. And when the last enemy fell, the 2 of them stood in the center of the ritual circle, breathing hard, their armor shattered and their bodies bleeding. "We did it," Lurian said, his voice weak. There was a gaping wound in his side, and Vespasian could see that the apothecary was dying. "We actually did it." "Yes," Vespasian said. He knelt beside his friend and took his hand. "We did." Lurian smiled. Blood flecked his lips, but his eyes were clear. "Do you think it was enough? All of this, all the years and the worlds and the fighting. Do you think it mattered?" Vespasian thought about the question. He thought about Lamentine and Harmonia's rest and Memoria. He thought about the scolums they had rebuilt and the tombs they had restored. He thought about the Emperor's words in the throne room, the acknowledgement that their efforts had not been in vain. And he thought about all the brothers who had fallen along the way, each one dying for something greater than themselves. "Yes," he said finally, "I think it mattered. Not because we earned redemption, but because we tried, because we chose to be better. That has to count for something." Lurian's smile widened. "Good," he whispered. "That's good." His eyes closed, and a moment later, his hand went limp in Vespasian's grip. Vespasian sat there for a long time, holding his friend's hand, staring up at the dead star overhead. He was alone now, the last of the penitent legion. He could feel his own wounds beginning, to pull at him, could feel his strength fading. He did not have long, but he still had enough time to do one last thing. He carried Lurian's body to the center of the ritual circle and laid him down gently. Then he gathered the bodies of the sorcerers and cultists and piled them around the circle's edge. When that was done, he activated a melter charge he had been carrying and set it on a timer. The explosion would destroy the moon's surface, ensuring that nothing remained of the ritual or the chaos forces that had attempted it. With his task complete, Vespasian sat down beside Lurian's body and waited for the end. The stars above were cold and distant, but they were also beautiful, and he found comfort in that. He had spent 200 years walking a path of penance, and now that path was ending. He did not know what awaited him after death. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps damnation. Perhaps, if he was very lucky, some form of peace. But whatever came, he would face it, as he had faced everything else since the pilgrimage began, with his eyes open, his heart pure, and his soul his own. The timer counted down. 3 minutes, 2, 1. And in the final seconds before the explosion, Vespasian spoke one last prayer. Not to the emperor, not to any god, but to all the souls they had failed and all the brothers they had lost. "We tried," he said simply. "We tried to be worthy, and if that was not enough, then at least we tried." The melter charge detonated. The moon's surface shattered. And Captain Vespasian of the 3rd Legion, last of the penitent, died as he had lived his final years, fighting for something greater than himself. In the vast darkness of the galaxy, his death went unnoticed. No songs were sung. No statues were raised. The Imperium did not mourn him, and history did not record his name. But on Terra, deep within the Golden Throne, a dying god who had once been a man opened his eyes for just a moment, and in that moment he saw the soul of a fallen son, rising toward him, scarred and broken but still fighting, still trying, still reaching for the light. And the Emperor wept,